Assalamu alaikum everyone. I am Javera Kulsum Atif and we are back again with another episode of Policy Beats. Today I am joined by Dr. Joshua Snider. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. And before that, I would like to give a small introduction to him. And although that may not be enough given all the work that you've done. So Dr. Joshua Snider is an educator and a researcher with over 10 years of university level teaching. His research spans from MENA to Indo-Pacific based on the design and implementation of CVE, counter-violent extremism. Currently, he's a professor at the UAE Defense College. So before we actually jump into our discussion that is based on counter-violent extremism, and Pakistan is we're not isolated or insulated from this.
Yeah.
So, sir, why don't you tell us how you actually got into this field? What led you to study this and then eventually become a professor too? Did you always want to teach?
I guess it's an eclectic story. I've been teaching and researching in this field in one way or another since 2006, and before that, I worked in government for a short time. I sort of came of age in the post 9/11 era, so I'm and I was involved in a small way in Canada's policy in its participation in the NATO mission in the early 2000s, and I think that really got me interested. And I was studying in Australia too at a different point in time, and Australia's relationship and proximity to the Indo-Pacific, to Indonesia in particular, really piqued my interest. And I just kind of fell into it. I was fascinated by Southeast Asia, and I was fascinated by the sort of pluralism and diversity of that region. And then the Bali bombings happened, which I was living in Australia at the time, and that was, pretty influential there. And it just sort of, one thing just sort of built on another. And I've always been interested in questions of identity
Right.
and how groups get along and don't get along. So I just kind of fell into it, I guess. And I did a master's thesis looking at radicalization or violent transformation of jihadist groups in Indonesia.
Right.
And then I did my doctoral work looking at sectarian nationalism or religion and nationalism in Southeast Asia, and this sort of constructed nature of nationalisms there, and then the use of religious ideology to sort of further or propel nationalism. So, yeah, and then I sort of shifted back to security studies.
Right.
I spent then 9 years lecturing in Malaysia, and I was teaching and researching mostly in areas related to security studies. And CVE, when I started, nobody used the term countering violent extremism.
Right.
CVE, it wasn't a thing then. There was counterterrorism, and then there was de-radicalization.
De-radicalization.
And I don't actually see de-radicalization as part of counterterrorism. That came up yesterday in the talk. I see disengagement or de-radicalization as actually part of CVE. Maybe that's just my own opinion. So yeah, when I started, CVE wasn't a thing, and then it was, and I started to sort of get involved with that, and have done some monitoring and evaluation work in the development community for CVE projects in a few countries. And then about 4 years ago, I got the job in Abu Dhabi.
Right.
And I shifted to the UAE National Defense College, and on it goes. So yeah.
So, as we talk about CV, and as you mentioned, it wasn't exactly a thing then. For our audience who may not necessarily know or understand how violent extremism is different from terrorism, how would you define it? And what are the levels through which you identify that a certain action or incident is related to violent extremism than terrorism?
Right.
We also know that we are yet to come to a definition for
Yeah,
terrorism. So
yeah.
do we have one for violent extremism?
Well, there are. I don't have a sort of, an academic working definition in my head that I can sort of spout off here. There are many you can find online. People have definitely tried to codify these definitions. I think the difference between terrorism and extremism can be the deed in itself. So terrorism expresses itself in terms of violent action,
Right.
right? So bombings, assassination, mob violence in some contexts might even, if it's organized and directed, that's the sort of classical definition that in terms of the sort of end product of terrorism.
Hmm.
Extremism is a wider category. So extremism is really is about the inspiration and the process through which people might get inspired to commit an act of violence associated with an ideology,
Right.
right? So it also extremism often manifests in terms of anti-pluralism,
Uh-huh.
right? So in the U.S. we're seeing a lot of white nationalist extremism. People, and it's hard because you speak to people who believe in some of these ideologies, and they don't see themselves as extremists, right? They see
Right.
themselves as patriots, as defenders of their faith,
I think this
as
is where.
believers. But the idea is in their minds there's a crisis,
Right.
right? In their mind, something we've gone so things have gotten so bad that they've been forced into action.
Right.
So that can get expressed as terrorism,
Mm-hmm.
but it can also get expressed in other forms of activism that are designed to demonstrate and perhaps shock,
Mm-hmm.
but that fall short of an act of terror,
All right. So
right?
that's.
So mass rioting to intimidate,
Mm-hmm.
which we see from groups,
Right.
right? Massive shows of presence where hundreds of thousands of people gather who are inspired by one type of ideology. That would be a sort of mass act of extremism, right?
Right.
Because their very presence is intimidating. Um, uh, Intimidating or targeting some groups. I know in the Indonesian context, um, some of the sectarian groups go after the gender rights NGOs,
Right.
right? And they intimidate these groups.
Mm-hmm.
You might say that's an act of extremism.
Mm-hmm. All
It's
right.
not being expressed as violence. They're not bombing the facilities,
Mm-hmm.
but they act in such a way that they're absolutely
Extreme actions, but just short of a
yeah,
terror
yeah,
attack.
perhaps, and then there's also this more complicated category of non-violent extremism,
Exactly. I was
which
actually
is
going to come to that.
really difficult to it's not difficult to define or describe in terms of what it is, but the law enforcement community and legal communities have a really difficult time with it in terms of whether it should be prosecuted,
Right.
right? So online activism, trolling,
Mm-hmm.
um, sending hate mail, online threats and intimidation.
Right.
All of this would fall into the category of online extremism or proffering ideas online,
Right.
right?
And we're seeing that a
Yeah,
lot,
absolutely.
especially with what's going on. And I would just like to chip in here. So, in Pakistan, of course, we're seeing a lot of political turmoil as well.
Yeah,
And that too stems from a place of extreme ideology or extreme following to a certain group or a certain leadership. And that sort of transpired online. We saw that online with more people coming together, institutions against institutions, etc. So my question then is, when with such a broad ambit of what exactly is violent extremism, when you're defining or designing policies for states, what is it that you prioritize, and how does that design come into being? And when you're doing so, who are the stakeholders in
yeah.
the process?
It, well, I think it's very much context specific,
Mm-hmm.
right? So states have to decide, first of all, that they have a problem with extremism, right? And states, many states have sort of multiple trajectories of extremism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in a place like the UK or Western Europe, extremism is a pervasive problem that comes from multiple sources. So
Right.
we're not just talking about one group,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're talking about groups who are using ideology because they want to change domestic politics, right? So we have versions of far right extremism. There's far left extremism, though that's less common today than it was at a certain point in time. Then we have the sort of uh, religio-political extremism associated with Islamist ideologies,
Right.
right? Jihadism, as it's been labeled by some, is another form of extremism. So states in the West are dealing with kind of multiple trajectories or
Right.
modes of extremism. So when they design policy and then then the question becomes, okay, well, we have law enforcement interventions, right?
Mm-hmm.
If people break the law, um, and things go too far and ending up in an act of terror, we can use the justice system to
Right.
persecute people. The question then becomes, well, what about activism that falls short of that?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we prevent, right? How do we counter this? So I would say that in that the interventions in terms of prevention might look similar, but they're going to be deployed differently based on the group in question.
Right.
Right. So if we're looking at in the context of Western Europe,
Mm-hmm.
far right extremism. So I don't know, like white nationalism,
Right.
ideologies where people are saying we want our states to be white nations,
White
all the
nations.
foreigners leave, this
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. The intervention that people you're targeting, that you're worrying about falling into that, are potentially very different than the people you're worrying about falling into uh, ISIL radicalization. Very
Right.
different constituencies. So the intervention is going to differ. So I don't think there's a one size,
Mm-hmm.
fits all. The stakeholders are going to vary as well,
Of
right?
course.
And in the old days, but remember in the patch that I work in the old days, so pre social media, pre blog, the pre blog era, uh, everybody was, it was all about the community,
Right.
right? It was all about interventions that were focused on states and NGOs engaging with community leaders
Right.
to talk to their young people,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And that was a fairly linear, I wouldn't say straightforward, but that was more straightforward. Now, what's the community?
Exactly.
Right, right. It's a digital
It's
community.
a digital
It's
community.
not just as simple as going into a suburb or a community, gathering the elders
Exactly.
and saying, talk to your young people, or gathering all the young people in
The
at an
young people
assembly.
aren't gonna
No,
listen.
they're
They've
not going to.
got Google
That's
to
right.
give them
Yeah, that's
answers.
right. I remember I was at an event in Australia many years ago, and in Australia there was a number of plots, and including a couple by young guys who purportedly got radicalized by al-Shabaab. They were
Oh.
young African migrants to Australia.
And one would wonder, looking at the geography, how Al Shabaab out of everything.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a big outcry about this, and what one of the community leaders said was, what we're worried about isn't when they show up for prayers.
Mm-hmm.
We're not worried about extremism in the community because we can deal with that. The
Right.
expressions, right? If people have bad ideas, if there's a community dinner and somebody starts, you know, um,
You can just debate
express,
on it.
you can debate. What they say, what we worry about is when people withdraw,
Right.
right? When we have young people who were engaging and were part of the community and suddenly kind of withdraw into their, I don't know if people have basements anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
withdraw into the family room or their bedrooms and then start to engage.
Isolation, practically.
Yeah, they worry about the isolation, and I think that was that was about 10 years ago that I heard this or more. So even going back that far, there was concern that sort of self radicalization or the sort of DIY
Right.
stuff was coming up, and I think that trend has really complicated the PVE CVE world in
Right.
terms of how do you reach people?
From this, I identify two important things then. You've got ideology and then a young population that requires economic security, that is looking for certainty in an uncertain world. With fluid ideas constantly around, how much weight would you give to ideology driving violent extremism and then acts of terrorism? Because we are often confused when we're tackling, for instance, in terms of Pakistan, Balochistan is a it's a difficult area for us. We've seen insurgencies in that region, and time we mentioned that this is due to the socio-economic disparity within the country that's existing, and that of course is to a very high degree as well. How much weightage do you give to ideology versus the socio-economic indicators when it comes to the youth becoming radicalized or moving towards violent extremism? And how do we dispel that?
Yeah, that's a really important and very vastly complicated. I mean, this is the core debate,
Right.
right? This is the core debate, and I don't think there's a cut and dry, answer to this. Again, context specific. I think there are probably contexts, especially in secessionist or ethno-nationalist
Right.
struggles within states where you've got sort of secessionism and ethno-nationalism being expressed as violent extremism,
Right.
right? Where these groups make a decision and attach their struggles to other ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday in the lecture, I was talking about the south of the Philippines and the south of Thailand, and how
Right.
both of those struggles started off as leftist struggles and then changed to a sectarianized struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Right, same with the Palestinian resistance. Right, the Palestinian resistance,
It was
it was
initially
it, it,
national
it was leftist.
local.
Right. The PLO was a nominally Marxist organization in its beginning, and then gradually sort of I say Islamized in air quotes. Right, they adopt another ideology to express themselves. So I think in going back to your question, I think in secessionist and ethno-nationalist struggles, when people perceive that they're being kept down by a state,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's true or not is context specific, then there's probably a level of dispossession that's probably a strong narrative,
Mm-hmm.
right? In what drives their struggle, right? The practical struggles, the not being integrated, lack of opportunity. Certainly, in the European context, if we look at Islamist extremism in Western Europe,
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely been a strong causal narrative
Right.
in it's in a place like France, though people contest this, right? People, as I'd say, well, what do we've given these people, it's always these people in air quotes, even though they're all, they share a common nationality. We've given them welfare, we've given them access, but what they say is it's the lack of opportunity for social mobility.
Right.
Right, it's the structural racism. It's the sort of day in day out grind of being on the receiving end of
Mm-hmm.
that does something to the psyche that makes the appeal of you know there's there's a concept called the identity entrepreneur,
Identity
and I
entrepreneur.
think it's a good concept, and we have a lot of in the Islamist space in particular a lot of identity entrepreneurs, right? People who build an agenda and market themselves and
Right.
market a worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And this worldview, I think, has appeal to people who are dispossessed in one way or another, however that looks.
Right.
Right. In Pakistan, that looks one way. In Belgium, that looks another. At the height of the civil war in Syria, and this sort of conflict volunteerism that
Mm-hmm.
saw tens of thousands of people sort of migrate to
Right.
to Syria to fight on behalf of the so-called Islamic State. They were seeing disproportionate numbers of young Belgians
Mm-hmm.
coming from one city. Like,
Right.
and then there were serious questions asked about what was going on in this place that like statistically, I don't have the figure in my head, but it was a huge ratio compared to anywhere else.
Right.
right? But objectively, none of these people were poor,
Oh, there you have it.
right? So, but they felt dispossessed. Probably they felt dispossessed. So it's not always feelings of dispossession don't always line up with.
The socioeconomic
Yeah,
indicators.
exactly. And of course, there is the problem that we've seen many of the most heinous attacks over the past 25 years perpetrated by people with university level education who are solidly middle class,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in some cases, we can't say that dispossession or poverty is the causal driver.
Right.
Um, Maybe some sort of existential dispossession rather than material dispossession, right? Feelings, people feeling sort of lost and isolated. People, you can feel lost and isolated even if you're a millionaire,
True.
right? So maybe there's something about that, and if we look to what's going on in the West right now, in the U.S. with sort of white nationalism, the so-called white nationalism, um, and who's getting involved in that, there are very clear indicators, sort of young white men
Mm-hmm.
of a certain age, of a certain socioeconomic class who typically haven't gone to university. Not objectively, they're not poor.
Mm-hmm.
They come from sort of nominal middle class backgrounds, whatever that means today. But there's some kind of existential dispossession that makes them interested in what's being offered by the identity entrepreneurs.
So we literally break it down to the psychosocial level.
I think so. In many cases, I think so. I mean, because if it was just about poverty,
Mm-hmm.
we would have a lot more violence,
That
right?
makes sense.
If it was just about poverty and dispossession, and there are probably some cases where poverty and dispossession is a better explainer than in others,
Right.
right? We see sort of violence associated with Islamist ideology on several continents,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think we can take a one size fits all. So perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at what's going on in the Sahel region right now.
Right.
Uh, it's possible that poverty is a better explainer there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in Western Europe, I don't think poverty is a great
Is
explainer because I don't think most of the people aren't objectively poor. Um, so I think that the psychosocial is in many cases a good yeah,
right. It's an indicator
yeah.
to understand. And also, I would like your input on, since we're talking about extremism, and also part of it is terrorism as well. What's the trajectory looking like when we're studying terrorism now? I mean, you have the digital societies, you've got all these digital platforms, even more easier for them. For example, here in Pakistan, the TTP recently, they broke the ceasefire, right? And that initially means that we have to now be prepared for what's to come. How do you see the MENA region coping with the upcoming trends of terrorism?
You know,
Who are the important actors now? We had Al Qaeda at one point,
yeah.
ISIL
I
here and
think
there.
I think all of the legacy actors haven't gone away,
Exactly.
right? I think the strategic gaze in the MENA has to some degree shifted from that conversation to sort of bigger geopolitical questions now,
Mm-hmm.
sort of great power competition,
Certainly.
the ongoing sort of strategic competition between the Gulf states and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I think that we're probably going to continue to see activism from the same actors
All right.
moving forward. Uh, how and when and the scale, um, I'm not sure. That's of course, if I knew that, right? Um, but in terms of trends, I think the one of the big trends that people talk about organizationally
Mm-hmm.
is the shift from structured and disciplined movements that have centers
Right.
to fragmented and destructured.
In silos.
Yeah, or where you've got small groups of people who aren't taking orders from anybody but are nominally inspired by all ideologies. They're not even really part of, I mean, cells are typically connected to bigger networks,
Right,
right?
right.
So you can't even call them cells. They're just groups of inspired individuals who take on an ideology and then plan to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, this trend should make security services very nervous, right? Because it's very difficult to get intelligence and to in terms of the counterterrorism aspect, uh, address this. If we're talking about organizations attack that plan attacks and that are centralized and disciplined,
Mm-hmm.
you can penetrate these organizations, right?
Right.
Eventually it might be hard, but eventually, you can do it. There's some kind of, it's hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
Inspired individuals, it's much harder because you have no idea who the proverbial bad guys are, right?
Exactly.
They appear out of nowhere. The good side, the upside to that is you get a lot more unsophisticated or not so well trained people doing things, and they often screw up, and attacks are kind of foiled because they're just not so competent,
Right.
right? But they can get lucky, and it can still result in catastrophic loss. I mean, I think the locus of violence and in terms of loss of life has, in terms of the impact of this
Mm-hmm.
ideology, has really shifted from the MENA region to some degree to to Africa. It's shifted southward. I mean, the levels of violence in the Sahel region, Nigeria,
Right.
it's staggering, and
Mm-hmm.
it's ongoing. Right, Somalia, there was just an attack not so long ago. Um, so again, it's context specific, right? And it's really difficult to talk about macro trends, across entire continents.
Right.
Probably in the MENA region, one of the issues that needs to be addressed are the refugee camps.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are still tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of people, Syrians and Iraqis, uh, in refugee camps, and these facilities, I mean, it's to a degree it's understandable why they're there, but there needs to be a multilateral solution to repatriate
Right.
the people in these camps, and governments are saying it too, right? These camps are breeding grounds for the next generation of extremism, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, States in the MENA region that are suffering catastrophic economic fragmentation. Lebanon, right?
Right.
The stakes are very high to fix some of these structural difficulties, because while poverty might not be an explainer of extremism, it definitely contributes.
Right.
So the extent to
Definitely.
which we don't have people in education or jobs, especially young men, and young women too, possibly, we're looking at a sort of another generation of the dispossessed who then start to maybe see the attractiveness of certain types of ideologies.
Well, Pakistan has had its fair share. We've been part and parcel of the war in terrorism, and along with other countries, of course. And in our experience, we've been effective in the counterterrorism part. And even now, there still needs to be work done on the CVE part
Mm.
of it. As you mentioned, it's still fairly recent. People are still trying to grasp it, understand it, and there's multiple layers to it. Um, and since you've studied, so lastly, I would like your input. And I understand that you would again argue that it's all about context. So, in the Pakistani context, what exactly, in terms of violent extremism, would you suggest in the policy design needs to be worked upon? And I'm pretty sure you might have some idea
Yeah.
of the ongoing work.
Yeah, so that's an important question, and I think that again, the difference between CVE and CT is the PVE CVE conversation comes before, right?
Right.
So you're looking at interventions for people who are either part of activism that is problematic, right? Everything short of people who have committed violence,
Mm-hmm.
right? So at the prevention end, messaging and the information environment. Then as you get involved in interventions, people who you think are vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is still countering, right? This isn't CT because somebody hasn't committed an act of violence yet,
Right.
right? So part of that is the state making the political decisions
Mm-hmm.
based on the advice about what ideology and what groups they find problematic. And this is where CT is easier than CVE,
Certainly.
right? Because CT is reactive. Something happens, or you have a ticking time bomb and you have intelligence, and you can move in and decapitate a threat. PVE, CVE involves making decisions about who you think is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a political calculation there too,
Right.
right? So I going back to Indonesia, right? One of the decisions the Indonesian government a number of years ago made a decision about certain groups.
Mm-hmm.
Hizbut Tahrir is a good example. For many years, Indonesia let HT operate openly. It was one of the few countries that did. And then at one point the government said nope, nope, no more. So the government made a decision. So the government made a decision to ban that group,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, the government made a decision to talk about ideology directly, to
Mm-hmm.
say this ideology is anti-nationalist, right? And then that then frames the CVE strategy because that's what you're worrying about. So in the Pakistani context, then if you're going to do sort of PVE, CVE outside the context of ethno-nationalist struggles. So if the government here is simply defining the problem of extremism
Mm-hmm.
as a function of an ethno-nationalist struggle, then that's a political decision,
All
right?
right.
And PVE and the CVE stuff can be um,
It will follow that lead.
it would follow that. The intervention would follow that.
Mm-hmm.
If there's an argument made that extremism is a wider spread phenomena,
Right.
right, that's penetrating beyond that ethno-nationalist constituency
Mm-hmm.
into the sort of mainstream middle class Islamabad, Karachi, right,
Exactly.
then that's a whole other conversation. And then at that point, the government has to make decisions about, well, what's problematic,
A multi-pronged policy
right?
then.
Perhaps a multi-pronged policy. Uh, what's problematic? What ideology is problematic?
Mm-hmm.
What group are you trying? Who's vulnerable? Right? Is this a
Right.
gender thing? Is this an age thing? Is this a socioeconomic status thing?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is this a regional thing beyond the ethno nationalist stuff? So then when you make that decision, then your interventions follow, right? And
Right.
and and and, and typically NGOs working in this area do a variety of things. So in the at the end, the sort of end of the line would be in prison interventions for
Right.
people who are incarcerated,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, the next level would be interventions for people who have maybe been cautioned or detained by the police.
Mm-hmm.
The next level would be people who um, who have associated with people who are in prison,
Right.
right? So family members and the police and can get all this intelligence, right? And you can reach out to people. Then the question is who to involve,
Hmm.
how to do it. And many states typically take a multi-pronged approach. And we talked about this yesterday. Do you need a priest or do you need a psychiatrist,
Right.
right? This sort of sectarian intervention in terms of curing or teaching
Mm-hmm.
proper ideology, or do you need psychosocial intervention,
Right.
right? Is there does maladaption or something like this explain why people so different states, different contexts, people do different things,
Mm-hmm.
but it begins with identifying, diagnosing
Diagnosing,
what the
certainly.
problem is and making a political decision about it, because there can be definite political costs to
Exactly.
doing this, and
Mm-hmm.
then the government has to sort of take that on and
It
actually
has to
make the
take
stand. Yeah,
exactly whether the decision is good or bad. It has
yeah,
to
it
be
has,
made by the government at
right,
the end.
yeah,
And the discourse could go on. It's honestly because there's so many problems coming in uh, on a social level, on a state level, we could possibly go on talking about it for another hour. But I think what I can wrap this up with is that possibly on an individual level, it really just boils down to what you're following, what you're choosing to follow, the actions that you're trying to take. And I think you should probably take care of people around you. We, in this age of technology,
Yeah,
we've sort of gotten too into it, too narrowed down, that we tend to forget to look around and see what's going
yeah.
on. So it's important to point out the right things from the wrong. And I guess that is where the state responsibility also comes in. Thank you so much, Dr. Joshua, for
Thank
your
you.
time. It was an interesting discourse. I would love to have talked more. Thank you so much for joining
Thanks.
us. Thank you to our audience members who listen to our podcast. We'll see you again on another episode.